The moment Keanu Reeves stood humble, and Anna with Sydney changed the crowd. The evening was alive with noise. Flashes from cameras filled the wide hall, and voices of reporters bounced against the tall walls. People had gathered to see a line of stars, all dressed in shining clothes, stepping onto the stage for a charity event. It was not only a night of glamour, but also a night where the world expected stories, speeches, and faces that carried weight. Among them stood Keanu Reeves. He had walked in quietly, not rushing, not showing off, his steps slow, his head slightly bowed. While others looked around to be noticed, Keanu seemed more concerned about not blocking anyone's way. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but some in the audience caught it. A whisper began to move through the crowd. "Look at him! Even here, he looks so humble!" The first few minutes of the event were loud. Cameras clicked endlessly, the host cracked jokes, and the audience laughed without thinking. But then came a moment that shifted the air. A young volunteer, nervous and unsure, tried to hand the microphone to Keanu too early. The boy's hands shook, and a few people in the front rows chuckled. The sound of their laughter felt sharp in the quiet boy's ears. His face dropped, and his hand froze mid-air. The crowd waited for Keanu's reaction. Many thought he would simply ignore it or let the host fix the mistake. But instead, Keanu gently took the mic with both hands, looked at the boy directly, and whispered words the mic barely caught. "Thank you, my friend." Then he gave the boy a soft smile, the kind that melts fear. The laughter in the front row stopped immediately. Silence spread, and the room began to shift. A moment of kindness had replaced what could have been another piece of embarrassment. Ana de Armas and Sydney Sweeney, who were standing a few steps away, noticed the change too. They exchanged a look, a quiet signal that they both understood what had just happened. This was no ordinary moment. This was a moment where humility had pushed aside mockery. The crowd, filled with important names and powerful voices, had suddenly gone quiet, waiting for more. Anna stepped forward, breaking the pause. She leaned close to the boy, still standing awkwardly at the edge of the stage, and she said with a warm voice that everyone could hear, "You did great. Thank you for helping us." Her words were simple, but the kindness in them was louder than the laughter had been. Sydney followed with a clap, encouraging the audience to join in, and slowly, the hall filled with applause. What could have been forgotten as a small accident was now remembered as a moment of respect. But the night had more layers hidden. As Keanu began to speak, his words were not grand or loud. He talked about how often small moments, unnoticed by most, carried the real meaning of life. He said, "Sometimes it's not the stage lights or the cameras that matter. Sometimes it's how we make one person feel seen." As he spoke, his tone carried no pride. It was not a speech designed to impress. It was quiet, calm, like he was sharing a truth with a friend. And in that quietness, people leaned in. Even those who had been whispering or looking at their phones now lifted their heads. Keanu's humility had created a pause strong enough to hold them. Yet, not everyone in the room welcomed the shift. A group of critics, seated near the back, felt uneasy. They had come expecting bold words and drama, not silence and softness. One of them muttered, "This is boring. Where's the energy?" Their voices were low, but Anna caught the sound. She felt the same rush of unease the boy had felt earlier, the sting of people choosing to dismiss kindness as weakness. And in that moment, she decided not to let the energy die. When Keanu paused, she stepped forward again and said, "What he just said is the reason we are all here. It's not about showing off, it's about remembering we can make someone feel valued. That's what changes a crowd. That's what changes a night." Her words hung heavy, and for the first time even the critics looked unsettled. Then came the twist that no one saw coming. As the applause grew again, a man from the audience stood up. His clothes were simple, unlike the shining suits around him. His eyes were filled with emotion, and his voice cracked as he spoke. My daughter was helped by the funds this event raised last year. She is alive today because of that help. And tonight, watching you all treat that young boy with kindness reminded me that real power is not in wealth or fame. It is in moments like this. The crowd turned to look at him, their faces struck silent. Some held their breath, others lowered their eyes. The glamour of the event had been replaced by something raw and real. The host, usually quick with jokes, had no words. Keanu nodded slowly toward the man, his face soft, and whispered again, "Thank you." The hall was no longer just a place of performance. It had become a mirror showing everyone who they were in that moment. Some had laughed, some had doubted, but now they all saw the truth. Humility had power, respect had weight, kindness had the strength to silence a crowd. And it was Keanu, Anna, and Sydney together who had turned the night into something unforgettable. The cameras still clicked, but now the faces captured were different, less about glamour, more about reflection. People were not just watching stars, they were watching a lesson unfold. As the first part of the evening closed, many in the crowd knew they would carry this moment long after the lights dimmed. It was not just about Keanu Reeves standing humble, or Anna and Sydney lifting the boy. It was about the way kindness, resilience, and respect had shifted the entire energy of a room filled with power. And deep down, every person knew the night was only just beginning. The weight of silence and the strength of voices the hall still buzzed with the aftershock of the first moment. Some people clapped with genuine warmth, others tried to hide the fact that their hearts had softened. Yet there was a tension floating in the air, something unspoken, like a thread waiting to be pulled. Keanu Reeves had stepped back a little, giving the stage space to breathe. His silence, even in a crowd of noise, carried weight. Anna stood close to him, her face calm but alert, as if she knew the night still held more than what anyone had seen. Sydney, with her eyes scanning the audience, felt the sharp energy of both admiration and doubt. She knew not everyone had been moved. Some had folded their arms, unimpressed, waiting for a flaw to point out. Then the host tried to lighten the mood again. With a forced laugh, he said, "Well, this is turning into something deeper than we planned. Let's keep it moving, shall we?" He gestured toward a group of performers waiting in the wings. The spotlight began to shift, but the crowd's eyes didn't fully follow. They were still caught in the echo of Keanu's words, and in the sight of the boy's face glowing with relief. The performers tried to start, but their music felt out of place, too rehearsed against the rawness that had just unfolded. During the awkward transition, whispers grew louder. A woman in the front row leaned toward her friend and said, "Was that real or just staged for attention?" Her words sliced through the delicate air. Others picked it up, some nodding, some shaking their heads. The doubt began to spread like smoke, pulling back the warmth that had started to settle. The boy, still holding the edge of the stage, lowered his gaze again, thinking he had caused more trouble than good. It was in that fragile moment that Keanu stepped forward again, slowly, as if he was careful not to break something delicate. He did not raise his voice. He simply said, "Humility is not a performance. Kindness is not a trick. If you question it, maybe it is because we are not used to seeing it in places like this." The crowd stilled. His words were not aimed at anger. They were mirrors, reflecting the unease in the room. Anna picked up his rhythm with ease. She spoke gently but firmly. "Sometimes the most real things feel strange because we live in a world that expects people to show strength only through pride or power. But strength also looks like respect. It looks like being gentle when you could be harsh." Her words added warmth to Keanu's steady tone. Sydney then leaned in, her voice soft but sharp enough to cut through the whispers. "Ask yourself, why do you doubt kindness? Is it because it feels rare? Or is it because you fear it might reveal something missing in all of us? The hall grew stiller. Even the critics, who had been restless, sat without a word. Suddenly, an older man from the audience stood. His face carried lines of experience, and his voice trembled with both weakness and fire. "You're right," he said. "We doubt because we've grown used to masks. We see actors, we see stars, and we expect the shine to be empty. But tonight, I saw something different. I saw a boy saved from shame. And I saw humility that did not need applause." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, as if his honesty pressed on their guarded hearts. The host tried to take control again, but the moment was too strong. People were no longer just watching a show. They were caught in something real, something they hadn't planned for. And then, the twist. From the very back of the hall, a group of critics decided to challenge the mood openly. One of them, a well-known journalist, raised her voice so the whole room could hear. "Words are easy. You say kindness, you say humility. But what about action? Are you willing to be humble when it costs you something? Or is it just easy to say on a stage?" Her tone was sharp, daring, testing. The room tensed. The challenge hung heavy. All eyes turned back to Keanu, Anna, and Sydney. Would they answer? Would they let the question break the fragile truth they had built? Keanu did not rush. He looked down at his hands, breathed deeply, and then raised his eyes. His face showed no anger, no pride, only calm. "You are right to ask," he said softly. "Words mean nothing if they do not match actions. Humility must live when no cameras are watching. Kindness must exist when no stage is lit." He paused, then added, "I will not prove it to you tonight, because true humility is not about proving. It is about living, and time will show if we mean what we say." The silence that followed was heavy, almost unbearable. But it was not emptiness. It was reflection. The crowd began to feel the weight of the challenge, not only for Keanu, Anna, and Sydney, but for themselves. Anna then stepped closer, her voice carrying the last note the audience needed to hear. "Humility is not tested in applause. It is tested in silence, in shadows, in how we treat the ones who cannot repay us. Maybe the real question is not for us, but for everyone here. When was the last time you chose kindness, even when it cost you something?" The hall did not clap right away. Instead, it breathed in the words. It was no longer about stars on a stage. It was about each person in that room. The energy had changed again, deeper, sharper, unforgettable. And somewhere near the corner of the stage, the young boy smiled quietly to himself. For the first time in the night, he felt not like a mistake, but like a reminder of what truly mattered. The unseen test of humility, the night moved forward, but the energy in the hall did not return to what it had been before. The laughter, the flashes, and the small gossips that once filled the room now felt weaker. People were not just watching for entertainment anymore. They were searching for meaning, something deeper, and they were not sure if they were ready to find it. The young boy had been quietly led off the stage by a volunteer, yet his presence lingered like a soft echo in every mind. Keanu remained calm, his hands loosely folded, his eyes scanning the crowd as if he could feel the weight of their questions. Anna and Sydney stood beside him, their shoulders straight, their faces firm yet gentle. The three of them were not putting on a show. They were standing in the middle of a storm of doubt, faith, and truth. Then, without warning, the host announced the next segment, an open auction to raise funds for the cause. The spotlight shifted toward items placed on display, signed posters, rare costumes, and even jewelry once worn in films. The crowd stirred with fresh excitement. Bidding wars had always been the highlight of such events. Money would flow, applause would rise, and pride would quietly feed itself under the surface. But tonight was not like other nights. When the first item was shown, a signed guitar from a famous musician, the bidding began loudly. Numbers were shouted, hands raised, yet something about it felt off. The energy of kindness had been replaced by the thrill of competition. A man near the front raised his hand with a smirk, not because he cared for the cause, but because he wanted to prove his wealth to the critics sitting across the aisle. The crowd cheered louder with every higher number, but the warmth that had filled the room earlier began to slip away. Keanu noticed, Anna noticed, Sydney noticed, and together they shared a silent glance. They knew this was the test. Humility had been spoken about, kindness had been defended, but now the crowd was showing how quickly it could forget. As the bidding hit a high number, the host laughed, delighted. "This is amazing," he shouted. "The charity will be blessed tonight." But at that very moment, an older woman in the back of the hall raised her hand. Her clothes were simple, her voice soft, almost shaking. She offered a number far lower than the rest. The crowd laughed quietly, mocking without words. The host, unsure, tried to move past her bid quickly. Keanu did not allow it. He raised his hand slightly, asking for the microphone. The host hesitated but handed it to him. Keanu's voice, steady and low, filled the hall. Every bid matters. Every gift matters. It is not the size that counts, but the heart that gives. If we laugh at someone's small offering, we forget the true reason we are here. His words cut through the noise like a blade through fabric. Anna stepped forward and added, "Sometimes, the smallest offering is the greatest sacrifice. Respect should never depend on numbers." Sydney, her eyes sharp and unwavering, said, "If kindness is only measured in wealth, then it is not kindness at all." The crowd grew quiet again. The woman lowered her hand, embarrassed, but Keanu turned toward her and bowed his head slightly, showing her the same respect he had shown the boy earlier. The gesture carried weight. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, their pride exposed. But then came the twist. One of the critics who had spoken earlier rose again, his voice carrying anger this time. "Words again! All you do is speak. If you really believe in humility, why don't you step down from the stage and sit with the rest of us? Stop being above us. Prove you mean it." Gasps ran through the hall. The challenge was bold, disrespectful even. People waited for Keanu to defend himself, to put the critic in his place. But instead, Keanu did something no one expected. He handed the microphone back, stepped down from the stage, and walked into the crowd. No security stopped him. No spotlight followed. He simply moved, slowly and quietly, until he found an empty chair in the middle of the audience. He sat down. No grand gesture, no explanation. Just a man among people. The hall froze. Whispers broke out. Cameras turned wildly, trying to capture him. The critic who had shouted looked unsettled, unsure if his challenge had won or if it had been answered with a humility so powerful that it left him without words. Anna and Sydney did not stay on the stage either. They followed him down, each taking a seat among strangers. The three of them, who had been expected to stand apart, had now blended with the crowd. It was no longer stars versus audience. It was people among people. And something strange happened. The audience began to shift as well. Some lowered their voices, some straightened their backs, and some even felt tears press at the corners of their eyes. Because in that simple act, they realized humility was not an idea. It was a choice. Then the older woman who had made the small bid stood again. With courage she had not shown before, she said, "I may not have wealth, but tonight I give with all I can. And seeing you sit here reminds me that kindness does not sit above. It sits beside." Her words carried a strength no money could match. The hall erupted, but not in cheers of pride. It erupted in applause that felt raw, real, and unforced. People clapped not for glamour, but for truth. And as the applause thundered, Keanu sat quietly, his head bowed once more, a soft smile on his face. Anna reached for the woman's hand. Sydney joined the applause herself, and in that moment, the night had shifted again, deeper than before, stronger than words alone. When humility split the room, the applause from part 3 had been loud, but as it slowly faded, something heavier remained in the air. Not everyone clapping felt joy. Some hands had struck together only because the moment demanded it. When the hall grew quiet again, the divide was clear. On one side were those whose eyes softened, who felt the weight of Keanu, Anna, and Sydney's choice to sit among them. They saw humility as a strength, a rare light in a place usually filled with pride. But on the other side were those who shifted in their seats, uncomfortable, even resentful. They felt as if their own importance had been diminished, as if the stage no longer belonged to them, but to something they could not control. Keanu, sitting calmly in the audience, noticed it. His silence was not weakness. It was a mirror, showing everyone who they truly were in that moment. Some looked at him and felt inspired. Others looked at him and felt challenged. Anna leaned slightly forward, studying the rows ahead of her. She could see the tension building. Sydney folded her arms gently, her eyes sharp, sensing what might come next. Then the host, nervous, tried to regain order. He forced a smile and said, "Well, that was unexpected. But let's not forget why we are here. We are raising money for a cause. Let's keep things moving." His voice trembled, betraying his unease. The bidding continued, but now it felt different. Some offered their numbers quietly, respectfully, inspired by the woman's courage and Keanu's gesture. But others pushed harder, raising bids with prideful tones, almost shouting as if to reclaim the room. And then came the moment that cracked the room open. A wealthy businessman, sitting in the second row, stood up with arrogance dripping from his voice. "This is ridiculous," he said loudly. "Humility doesn't save lives, money does. So let's stop pretending respect matters more than power. Watch this." He raised his hand and shouted a number 10 times higher than the last bid. Gasps echoed through the hall. The host nearly stumbled over his own words in excitement. For a moment it seemed the businessman had stolen the stage. The applause returned, but this time it felt empty, forced. The businessman smirked, glancing toward Keanu, waiting for a reaction. Keanu turned his head slightly, his eyes calm but unshaken. "Thank you," he said simply. "Your gift will help. But remember, money without humility can build walls instead of bridges." The businessman's smile faltered. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, others looked uneasy. The divide deepened between those who believed humility gave meaning to giving and those who believed power was all that mattered. Anna chose that moment to stand. Her voice was soft but carried across the hall. "Tonight is not about who gives more. It is about why we give." The woman in the back gave from her heart. This man gave from his wealth. Both matter. But which will inspire others tomorrow? Which will live beyond tonight? Sydney added, her tone sharper. "If we give only to show our strength, we are not giving. We are buying pride, and pride fades fast." The crowd shifted again. Some clapped, others folded their arms tighter. The businessman sat back down, his jaw clenched. The host looked trapped, caught between excitement for the money raised and fear of the truth being spoken. And then, the twist no one expected arrived. From the far side of the room, a young woman stood. She was trembling, but her eyes carried fire. "I was helped by this charity last year," she said, her voice breaking but growing stronger with every word. "My little brother would not be alive without it. But let me tell you this. The money helped, yes. But what gave us the strength to keep fighting was not the money. It was the way strangers treated us, with kindness, with respect. If you think humility doesn't save lives, you've never seen a dying child smile because someone held his hand. The hall froze. Even the businessman lowered his eyes. Silence spread, heavy and sharp, like the truth had landed on every heart in the room. Keanu bowed his head toward the young woman. "Thank you," he whispered, the same words he had spoken earlier to the boy and to the man who had stood before. It was not just gratitude, it was honor. The divide in the room was no longer hidden. Some wiped their eyes, moved deeply. Others sat stiff, angry at truths they did not want to face. Humility had not just inspired, it had exposed. Anna felt it too. She turned to Sydney and whispered softly, "This is more than a night now. This is a battle of hearts." Sydney nodded. And not everyone wants to lose. The hall waited, breathing heavy, knowing the night was far from finished. Humility had already shifted the room twice. Now it had split it in two. What would happen next would decide which side would grow stronger. The storm against kindness. The air inside the hall had grown heavy, as if every word spoken weighed on the shoulders of those present. Some sat in quiet reflection, their hearts softened by the voices of humility. Others clenched their fists or shifted uncomfortably, resisting the truth that had been laid bare. The young woman's words about her brother still echoed in the silence, and for many, it was impossible to forget. But silence rarely lasts long in a crowd divided. From the back rows came the sound of footsteps, deliberate, loud, breaking the fragile calm. One of the critics, the same journalist who had spoken earlier, rose to her feet. Her eyes were sharp, her voice clear, carrying over the audience like a blade. "Enough," she said. "We came here for an event, not a sermon. People don't need lessons about humility from actors. They need results. They need money. And all of this talk about kindness, it's nothing but distraction." The crowd stirred. Some nodded in agreement, others frowned. The businessman from earlier leaned back in his seat, a small smile creeping back onto his face, as if pleased that someone else was finally saying what he believed. Anna rose slowly, her movements calm, but her eyes burning with quiet fire. "Do you think kindness is a distraction?" she asked, her voice steady. "Then you've never seen how one gentle act can change the way someone survives their hardest day." The journalist crossed her arms. "Kindness doesn't pay hospital bills. Humility doesn't feed the hungry. Stop pretending it does." Sydney leaned forward, her voice sharper than Anna's, slicing through the tension. "And pride doesn't heal hearts. Arrogance doesn't save lives either. You say results matter, but what is the value of results if people are treated like numbers and not human beings?" The hall erupted with murmurs again. The divide was growing sharper, more dangerous. And then the sabotage began. The journalist raised her hand, and suddenly a group of her colleagues stood as well. They had planned it, waiting for their moment. One after another, they began speaking over each other, their words clashing like stones thrown into water. "This is nothing but performance. Humility is weakness. Stop wasting time. Let the wealthy take control." Their voices grew louder, overlapping, trying to drown out the calm tone of Keanu, Anna, and Sydney. The host, panicked, tried to speak, but his voice was buried beneath the chaos. Cameras flashed wildly as reporters tried to capture the argument, eager to turn it into headlines. Keanu sat still through it all, his face unreadable. He did not rise, he did not shout. He simply waited, as if letting the storm crash around him. His silence was not surrender, it was strength. Finally, when the shouting began to weaken from its own noise, he stood. He did not walk to the stage. Instead, he stood where he was, in the middle of the audience, his voice calm but powerful enough to carry. "You can speak as loud as you want. But ask yourself, why are you afraid of humility? Why are you afraid of kindness? Maybe it is because it reminds you of what you lack. Maybe it is because it asks you to give more than money. It asks you to give your heart. And that is harder. The hall quieted. The critics glared, but their words no longer carried the same fire. The audience was listening again. Then came the twist. The wealthy businessman, still bitter from being challenged earlier, rose to his feet once more. His voice boomed, filled with pride. If humility matters so much, then prove it. Give something you cannot afford to lose. Let's see if you can be humble when it costs you. The challenge was sharp, cruel, and it cut through the hall like a knife. Eyes turned to Keanu, waiting, some eager to see him fail. Anna's breath caught. Sydney clenched her jaw. They knew this was the moment the critics had been waiting for, the trap to expose humility as nothing but fragile words. Keanu did not flinch. His gaze softened, and he said only, "If humility is tested by loss, then I will accept the test. But understand this. True giving is not about showing others what you lose. It is about choosing to lose quietly, without needing the world to watch." The businessman laughed bitterly. Easy words, but nothing more. And just as the tension seemed ready to explode, the older woman who had bid earlier rose again. Her voice was shaky, but it carried across the hall. I gave what I could. It was small, but it was my sacrifice. And if you think sacrifice must be proven, you don't understand giving. Because real sacrifice is silent. It does not ask for an audience. Her words, unexpected and pure, silenced even the businessman. The hall shifted once more. The sabotage had tried to turn humility into weakness, but instead, it had revealed the critic's fear and the strength of ordinary people. Keanu bowed his head to the woman once again, whispering, "Thank you." Anna reached for Sydney's hand, both of them feeling the truth settle again. Humility had survived the storm, but deep down, they knew the night was not over. The critics would not give up so easily, and the hardest test was yet to come. The cost of humility. The hall sat in uneasy silence after the storm. The older woman's words had pierced the noise, but everyone could feel the air shifting again. Humility had held its ground, but the critics had not been defeated. They waited like shadows, whispering among themselves, their eyes sharp, their pride still unbroken. Keanu remained standing in the middle of the audience, calm, quiet, his presence steady like a tree rooted in heavy wind. Anna and Sydney sat near him, their faces calm but alert, ready for the next strike. The host, trying to calm the tension, announced the final auction item. A rare necklace, once worn in a film that had become a worldwide symbol of hope. The crowd stirred with new energy, the sparkle of wealth pulling them back into old habits. The critics smiled, sensing an opening. The bidding began fast and loud. Numbers flew higher and higher. The wealthy businessman raised his hand again, determined to take control of the room. Every bid he made carried arrogance, as if he were buying not just the necklace, but also the power to silence humility. People cheered him, some out of respect for his wealth, others out of fear. Keanu watched quietly, his eyes soft. Anna leaned closer to him and whispered, "They want to drown the night with pride. They want to prove kindness can't stand against money." Sydney shook her head, her voice firm. "But kindness doesn't need to fight with money. It just needs to show where the real strength lies." The bids climbed to an impossible number. The host's excitement grew, his voice nearly trembling as he called the next offer. Then, when it seemed certain the businessman would win, a small voice came from the back. It was the same young woman who had spoken earlier about her brother. Her hand rose, her voice shaking but steady. She offered a number so small compared to the rest that the host froze. unsure of how to respond. The businessman laughed, loud and mocking. "That's not even enough to buy the box the necklace comes in," he said, his tone cruel. The crowd laughed nervously with him. The young woman's face flushed with shame. But before the moment could break her, Keanu raised his hand and said quietly, "I will cover the rest." The hall gasped. The host stammered, "Sir, do you mean you want her bid to count?" Keanu nodded. "Yes, let her gift be enough. I will stand beside her." The hall exploded with noise. Some cheered wildly, others argued. The businessman stood furious. "That's not humility, that's showing off," he shouted. "You're only trying to prove yourself. You can afford it. How is that sacrifice?" Keanu turned his head, his voice calm, steady. "This is not about me. This is about her. She gave from her heart. My part is only to make sure her sacrifice is honored, not mocked." Anna stood, her voice filled with warmth. "Real humility lifts others so their voices are heard. Tonight, this young woman's voice matters more than any number." Sydney rose as well, her eyes unshaken. "You call it weakness. I call it strength, the kind of strength you can't buy." But the critics struck harder. The journalist raised her voice again, sharp and biting. "Then give something that costs you everything. If you truly believe in humility, prove it by giving away what you hold most dear." The crowd gasped. The words were cruel, cutting deep. All eyes turned to Keanu. Anna's breath caught, her heart racing. Sydney clenched her fists, fury rising in her eyes. It was no longer a debate. It was a demand for sacrifice. Keanu did not move for a long moment. The hall held its breath, waiting. Then, slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver ring. It was not flashy, not valuable in money, but it carried weight. He held it gently in his palm, his voice soft but clear. "This ring belonged to my father. It is the only piece of him I carry with me. It has been with me for years. Tonight, I give it away, not because I want to prove anything, but because humility asks us to let go of what we cling to most. If it can help this cause, let it go." The hall froze. Silence pressed down like a heavy blanket. No one spoke. No one laughed. The critics, for the first time, looked shaken. The businessman lowered his eyes. The journalist opened her mouth but found no words. Anna's eyes filled with tears. She whispered, "Keanu?" her voice breaking. Sydney's jaw trembled, her eyes wide with disbelief and admiration. The young woman in the back began to cry. "You don't have to," she said softly, her voice trembling. "You've already given enough." Keanu shook his head gently. "Kindness is never enough. It must keep going, even when it costs us." Then, without another word, he placed the ring on the table beside the necklace. The hall erupted, not with laughter, not with mockery, but with applause so powerful it shook the walls. People stood, clapping with tears in their eyes. The critics sat still, unable to fight against the truth anymore. In that single act, Keanu had done what words alone could not. He had proven that humility was not weakness, not performance, but sacrifice. And in doing so, he had changed the night forever. But as the applause filled the room, a quiet question remained. What would the cost of this sacrifice be when the night ended? Because humility does not just move hearts. It also unsettles those who cling to pride. And pride never leaves without a fight. When humility became the final voice, the hall was still vibrating from the sound of applause. Keanu's sacrifice of the ring had pierced the pride that had ruled the room only moments before. Yet, in the corner, the critics gathered like storm clouds. Their pride was wounded, their control slipping. The businessman clenched his jaw. The journalist whispered hurriedly to her colleagues, and the mood of division threatened to rise again. Keanu sat quietly, his head bowed, his hands folded as if in prayer. Anna and Sydney stood near him, watching the shifting faces in the crowd. Some people glowed with inspiration. Others looked unsettled, unsure how to respond. The night had already gone beyond speeches, beyond auctions. It had become a battlefield of values. And the final test was yet to come. The journalist stood once more, her voice sharp and unyielding. Applause does not prove truth. People are easy to sway by emotions, but emotions fade. Sacrifice is only real if it lasts beyond one night. When the cameras go off, who will still care about humility? Who here will give anything tomorrow? Her words spread doubt again, pressing on the crowd like a shadow. The businessman rose beside her, his voice booming. You all cheer for humility, but the world runs on power. Tonight, you may clap for kindness, but tomorrow, you'll go back to chasing wealth. Admit it. You only cheer because it feels good in this moment. It changes nothing. The hall grew restless. Murmurs rippled through the audience. The critics had thrown their final strike, and for a moment it seemed the storm might return. Keanu slowly lifted his head. His voice was calm, almost gentle. You are right about one thing. Emotions fade. Nights like this end. But humility is not about one night. It is about the choices we make when no one is watching. And those choices do not need cameras to matter. Anna stepped beside him, her eyes steady, her voice strong. We cannot control what the world chooses tomorrow, but we can choose tonight. And if even one person walks away from here ready to be kinder, more respectful, then tonight is not wasted. One spark can light another. That is how change begins. Sydney joined them, her tone sharp and clear, cutting through the last threads of doubt. And if you think power wins in the end, look around you. What silenced this room tonight was not money. It was not arrogance. It was a simple act of humility. You cannot buy the respect that was born here tonight. You cannot erase the truth that kindness changed us. The crowd shifted. People began to rise to their feet, not all at once, but slowly, like a tide building strength. First a few, then more, until the majority were standing clapping, not for spectacle, not for wealth, but for the truth they had seen. The critics looked around, their faces pale, realizing the crowd had slipped from their grip. Then, the most unexpected twist arrived. The young boy from the beginning, the one who had handed Keanu the microphone, walked back on stage. His small hands trembled, but his voice carried courage. I thought I ruined everything earlier, but you all showed me that even mistakes can be turned into something good. I may not have money or power, but I promise I will carry kindness with me, because tonight I saw what it can do. His words were simple, but they broke what pride could not. Tears rolled down faces across the hall. People who had laughed at him earlier now clapped for him with all their strength. Keanu stood slowly, bowed his head toward the boy, and whispered once more, "Thank you." Anna took the boy's hand, raising it gently, while Sydney clapped louder than anyone else, her face lit with pride. The boy's small smile shone brighter than the lights on the stage. The critics sat in silence, defeated not by force, but by humility itself. The businessman lowered his head. The journalist pressed her lips shut. Pride had no voice left in the hall. The event ended not with the glitter of wealth or the noise of pride, but with the quiet truth of respect, humility, resilience, and kindness. People left the hall carrying more than just memories. They carried a challenge, to live the same way they had seen lived before them. Outside, the night air was cool. The cameras faded, the lights dimmed, but the power of what had happened lingered. Keanu, Anna, and Sydney walked out together, not as stars, but as people, their steps calm, their faces at peace. Behind them, strangers whispered to one another about kindness, about humility, about change. And for the first time, the crowd left not entertained, but transformed. Because in the end, it was not the stage, the auction, or the wealth that people remembered. It was the moment Keanu Reeves stood humble and Anna with Sydney changed the crowd.